Les Miserables, what if your crime could never be deleted? A modern what-if retelling. Chapter 1, The Amber Flag. The gate made no sound when it opened. In the old prisons he had read, there was a ritual to release. Iron bars groaning, bolts falling, the echo of a guard's boots down a corridor of stone. But 19 years later, the thing that sent Valjean back into the world was a single glass panel that slid sideways with a sound almost too soft to hear. No blessing, no curse, only a synthetic voice, patient and gender-neutral, saying, custodial term complete, reintegration active, confirm identity to receive your civic profile. He pressed his thumb to the reader. The wall showed him his own face, older than he remembered, the beard gone gray at the edges, and beneath it a long string of numbers, and beneath that a single field lit in a color he would come to hate more than any color in the world. Amber. They did not call it a criminal record anymore. That phrase belonged to the century of paper, of files in drawers, of ink that could fade. Now they called it a trust index, and everyone carried one from the day they were born, a quiet number that followed you through every door and every transaction. Most people never thought about theirs. It sat green and untroubled in the corner of their lives, the way health sits in the body of someone who has never been sick. His was amber. When he tapped the detail panel, he could not stop himself. A permanent flag unfolded like a stain spreading through cloth. Violent felony, property offense, repeat escape attempts, custodial extension times 3. 19 years for a loaf of bread and the desperations that grew out of it, the hunger of a sister's children, the door he had broken, the 4 attempts to run from a sentence that had swallowed his whole young life. The system did not record the bread. It recorded only the flag. He walked out into a city that read him before he could speak. It happened the first time at a food kiosk 3 streets from the release center. He had credit. The state loaded a small reintegration sum onto every profile, enough for a week if a man was careful. He chose bread, of course, some private joke with his own history. He held his thumb to the reader, and the machine paused, and then the little screen turned amber to match his soul, and displayed politely in letters bright enough for the woman behind him to read. Transaction declined. Vendor trust threshold not met. The vendor did not even look cruel. That was the thing he would remember. She looked apologetic, the way a person is apologetic about weather. It's automatic, she said. I can't override it. If I sell below threshold, my own index drops. She said it kindly. She said it the way you explain gravity to a child who has fallen. He put the bread down. Behind him, the next customer stepped back half a pace, not in fear exactly, but the way you step back from a wet-painted wall. Their devices had warned them. The air itself seemed to know what he was. That night he learned the geometry of the new world. There were places an amber man could go and places he could not, and the boundaries were invisible until you struck them. Shelters required a threshold. Transit required a threshold. The warm lobbies where ordinary people waited out the cold read your flag at the door and simply would not let the door open. He stood outside one such lobby and watched, through glass, a man asleep in a chair, green and safe and dreaming, and he understood that the wall between them was not glass. The glass was only the shape the wall had taken. He slept that first night in a maintenance alcove behind a transit vent, where the warm exhaust of the trains kept the frost off his hands. He was 51 years old. He had entered prison at 32. In the 19 years between, the world had built a machine that never forgot and had taught itself to call that machine fairness, because the machine treated everyone the same, and the flag it read was, after all, true. He had done what it said he had done. That was the cruelty he could not argue with. The system did not lie about him. It simply refused to let him become anything else. By the 3rd day, the reintegration credit was nearly gone, spent in the few marginal places that would take amber money at a markup. A hostel run by a man who charged double and watched his guests like livestock. A vending wall in a district where no one's index was clean enough to care about anyone else's. On the 4th day, cold and half-starved and carrying a rage he did not yet have a name for. He saw a house with its lights on and its door unguarded, and something in him that had learned nothing in 19 years began, quietly, to plan. Chapter 2: The Silver. The house belonged to an old man named Bienvenu Myriel. Valjean did not know this when he knocked. He knocked because it was the first door in the city that had no reader on it, no glass eye above the handle, no soft chime of a device tasting his index before a human could decide. It was an old door, wooden, with a brass knocker worn smooth. He knocked because he had run out of every other kind of door. The old man opened it himself. He was thin, past 70, with the kind of face that has been worn down to its essentials. He looked at Valjean, at the stay-tissue clothes, the unshaved exhaustion, the particular hollowness of a man who has been refused many times in a row, and he did something no one had done in 4 days. He stepped back and opened the door wider. "You're cold," he said. "Come in." "You should scan me first," Valjean said. He heard the bitterness in his own voice and could not stop it. "Everyone scans first. Do it. Get it over with." "I don't own a reader," the old man said. "I find they tell me the one thing about a person I could learn for myself in 5 minutes and none of the things that take longer." He was already moving toward a small kitchen, already filling a kettle. "Sit. There's soup. It isn't much." Valjean sat because his legs had decided the matter before his pride could. He ate like an animal and hated himself for it and ate anyway. The old man talked, undemanding, about nothing, the weather, a neighbor's cat, the difficulty of getting decent bread since the small bakeries had closed. He did not ask what Valjean had done. He did not ask what his index was. He set a plate in front of a stranger and refilled it when it emptied, and when Valjean said harshly, because he could not bear the gentleness, "You don't know what I am," the old man only said, "I know you're hungry. The rest is your business, not mine, unless you want it to be." He gave Valjean a bed, real sheets, a door that closed. Before he left the room, the old man paused and said, without weight, as if it were the most ordinary observation in the world, "You've been told you're a danger so many times that you've started to carry it for them. You don't have to carry it here. Good night." Valjean lay in the dark and could not sleep, and the reason he could not sleep was the sideboard he had seen in the front room. A case of silver, real silver, heirloom silver, the last valuable things a man like Myriel would own. Old, untagged, untraceable. In the marginal economy where amber men lived, silver did not ask about your index. Silver was green to everyone. He told himself many things in the dark, that the old man was a fool and fools deserved their lessons, that the system had already decided what he was, so why should he disappoint it? That 19 years had taught him only one law, and the law was take before it is taken from you. He rose before dawn. He wrapped the silver in a cloth. He went out the unguarded door into the gray morning and he ran. They caught him by noon. Not the old man, a street patrol whose devices flagged the mismatch between an amber man and a pocket full of untagged silver, and who did what patrols do. They brought him back to the house to confirm the theft, holding him by the arms, already certain, already writing the extension to his sentence in their heads. Valjean did not look up. He knew this part. This was the part where the truth about him became, once again, the only thing anyone would ever see. Myriel came to the door in his dressing gown. The patrol officer said, "Sir, we recovered these items on this individual. Can you confirm they were taken from your residence?" And the old man looked at Valjean, a long look, unhurried, the look of a man doing arithmetic of a kind the officers did not have a word for, and said, "Taken? No, I gave them to him." He turned, unbothered, and lifted 2 silver candlesticks from the sideboard and held them out. "But you left in such a hurry you forgot these. They're the best of the set. It would have been a shame." The officer's device did not know what to do. There was no flag for this. The machine could read a felony index in 1/100th of a second, but it had no field for a man giving his silver to the person who had stolen it. The officers hesitated, checked their screens, checked each other, and finally, because the machine had gone silent and they had nothing left to charge, let go of Valjean's arms and left, uneasy, as if they had witnessed a small tear in the fabric of a world they had trusted to be seamless. When they were gone, the old man pressed the candlesticks into Valjean's hands and closed the stranger's shaking fingers around them. "Listen to me," he said quietly, not gently now but with a strange, fierce clarity. "They will read your flag for the rest of your life. I can't change that. I'm one old man, but the flag is a fact about your worst day. It is not a fact about your soul, and no machine that has ever been built can read the second thing because the second thing isn't finished yet. You get to keep finishing it. That's the only part that was ever yours." He stepped back. "The silver is yours. I've bought something with it. I've bought the man you haven't decided to become. Don't sell him cheap." Valjean stood in the doorway with the candlesticks heavy and cold in his hands, and something in him that 19 years of amber refusal had sealed shut broke open all at once, painfully, the way a limb aches when the blood returns. He walked out of the city that day a thief in the eyes of every machine he passed, and for the first time since the gate had opened without a sound, something else in the eyes of one man who owned no reader. He did not yet know what he would build with what he had been given, but he had stopped at last, agreeing with the flag. Chapter 3: The Man Who Was Someone Else. 7 years is enough time to build a person. The town of Montreal did not know the man who arrived that spring, and that was the entire point. He came with a green index, a clean one, purchased through the gray channels that amber men whispered about, where a broker took the last of your silver and through some quiet corruption of a records clerk in a distant office, gave you a new number attached to a new name. It was not legal. It was the single most illegal thing a man could do in a world built on the sanctity of the index, worse in the eyes of the law than the theft that had earned him amber in the first place. To forge a trust score was to attack the foundation of everything. And Jean Valjean, who now called himself Monsieur Madeleine, had done it not to steal, but to be allowed to work. That was the paradox he carried into his new life like a stone in his shoe, and he never once managed to walk without feeling it. He was good at work. He had always been good with his hands, and prison, whatever else it takes, gives a man time to think, and he had spent 19 years thinking about how things fit together. He started small, a workshop repairing the automated sorting units that every warehouse in the region depended on and no one knew how to fix. Within 2 years, he owned the workshop. Within 4, he had built a manufacturing line of his own, a modest one, making a component that turned out to be necessary everywhere, and the town that had been dying began, quietly, to live again around him. And here was the thing that unsettled him most. In the rare hours he allowed himself to feel anything, he was, by every visible measure, good. He paid more than he had to. He hired the people no one else would hire, not amber. He could not risk drawing that kind of attention, but the near amber, the borderline, the ones whose indexes had dipped for a missed payment or a family member's disgrace, and who found every door in the region politely closed. He built a clinic. He argued at the regional council for a thing so radical they thought him a harmless eccentric, that a person's index should be allowed to recover, that the flag should soften with years, that a man's worst day should not be his permanent address. They liked him for it, the way you like a man rich enough to afford idealism. They elected him mayor, and he accepted because to refuse would have drawn as much attention as to accept, and because some starved part of him, the part that had knocked on Mariel's door, wanted, desperately, to be a man that a town would choose. But he knew what he was. Every ordinance he signed with a hand that belonged legally to no one. Every time a citizen thanked him, they were thanking a green number that was a lie, and the lie sheltered a truth, violent felony, property offense, that would have made every one of them step back that half pace, the way the stranger at the kiosk had all those years ago. He had built genuine good on a foundation of genuine fraud, and he could not tell, some nights, whether the good redeemed the fraud or the fraud poisoned the good. Myriel had said, "You get to keep finishing the man." But Myriel had not told him what to do when the only way to be allowed to become good was to lie about who you had been. Into this town that winter came a woman named Fantine. She was young, younger than she looked, because poverty ages the face before the body. She had a green index, or nearly, when she arrived, and she came to Madeleine's factory because it was known, quietly, along the corridors where desperate people share information, that this was a place that hired the ones the machine had turned away. She was a good worker. She was quiet, and she watched the other women warily, and she sent almost everything she earned to an address in another town. And Madeleine, who noticed everyone but interfered with no one, did not learn her story until it was already destroying her. The story was ordinary, which is the worst thing about it. She had a daughter. The daughter's father had left, not cruelly, just completely, the way men in that world left, dropping out of a life like a stone out of a hand. And a single fact in that world was fatal. A child born outside a registered partnership carried a provisional flag on the mother's index. It was meant, the policy papers said, to encourage stable families and responsible planning. What it did in practice was mark every unpartnered mother as a small, permanent risk. A dip in the number that made rent harder, credit harder, work harder. A stone tied to the ankle of exactly the women least able to swim. So Fantine had done what such women did. She had lied. She had left the child with a family in another town, the Thénardiers, who ran a child-minding arrangement and who understood, with the instinct of predators, that a woman hiding a child would pay anything and could complain to no one. She had scrubbed the provisional flag from her visible profile through the same gray channels Valjean himself had used, and she had come to Montreuil to earn, in secret, the money that fed a daughter whose existence she had to deny in order to be allowed to feed her. It held for a while. It always holds for a while. It came apart when a supervisor in the factory, a woman named Madame Victurnien, who had the specific, tidy cruelty of a person who believes she is upholding standards, grew suspicious of the money Fantine sent away each month, and through a small network of the self-appointed righteous, pulled the thread until the hidden child unraveled into the light. She reported it, not to Madeleine, to the system, which was the only authority such people truly trusted. And the system did what it was built to do. It corrected the record. Fantine's provisional flag returned, and with it a second flag now for index falsification, the very crime, though neither of them knew it, that the mayor who employed her had committed on a far greater scale. The rules of the factory, written by managers in Madeleine's name during a period he had delegated too much and watched too little, were clear. Falsification was cause for immediate termination. It happened while he was away. When he learned of it, weeks later, the machine had already ground her down to nothing, dismissed, unhirable, her index now a color that closed every honest door in the region. The Thénardiers' demands rising as her ability to pay collapsed. The whole terrible arithmetic of a poor woman's life resolving, as it always resolved, toward the single asset the world would still let her sell. By the time Madeleine understood what had been done in his name, Fantine was dying. Not metaphorically. The illness that poverty breeds had taken hold in a body that had sold everything sellable to keep a machine somewhere from lowering the number attached to her daughter's future. And when the mayor of Montreuil finally stood at the bedside of the woman his own factory had destroyed, he understood the shape of the trap he had spent 7 years pretending he had escaped. The system had not singled her out. It had not hated her. It had treated her exactly the same as everyone, applied its rules without malice and without exception, and in doing so had killed her as surely as any hand. And he, Madeleine, Valjean, the green lie and the amber truth, had built his sanctuary from the exact same fraud that the machine had just executed her for, and had prospered where she had died, for no reason he could name except that his broker had been better and his luck had held. "I want to see my daughter," Fantine said near the end. She did not know who he was. She only knew he was the mayor, the good man, the one the town trusted. She reached for his hand, a green man's hand, she thought, and she asked the one thing the machine had spent her whole life making impossible. Promise me. Promise you'll bring her to me. Cosette. Her name is Cosette. And Jean Valjean, who owned nothing that was truly his, not even his name, made a promise that would cost him the entire life he had built. I promise, he said, I'll bring her whatever it takes. He did not yet know that the man who would make him keep that promise the hard way, the man already, that very week, arriving in Montreal with a new posting and a suspicion he could not yet articulate, was standing closer than he thought. Chapter 4: The Auditor. Javert did not believe in evil. This was the thing most people misunderstood about him, and it was the thing that made him dangerous. Evil implied choice, malice, a soul turning deliberately toward the dark, and Javert, who had risen from nothing to become a regional compliance auditor, the highest rank a man of his origins could reach, did not believe the human soul was reliable enough to be trusted with anything as important as its own judgment. He had seen too much. He had been born too low. His mother's index had been the color of the bottom, and everything Javert had ever achieved, he had achieved by the single ferocious act of faith that organized his entire life. The belief that the system was better than the people inside it, that the number was cleaner than the man. That justice, to mean anything at all, had to be a machine, impartial, incorruptible, incapable of the mercy that had, in his experience, never once been extended to a boy like him. He loved the index the way another man might love God, and like a certain kind of believer, what he could not forgive, what genuinely disturbed the foundations of his peace, was not sin. Sin was accounted for, sin was in the record, but the thing the record could not explain. Monsieur Madeleine was such a thing. Javert arrived in Montreal to audit the region's compliance metrics, a routine posting, and within a month he had developed a discomfort he could not file under any category. The mayor was too good, not suspiciously charitable in the way of men laundering a reputation. Javert knew that pattern, could smell it, but good in a way that had texture, that seemed to come from somewhere the man never spoke of. He had a green index, spotless, the record of a life so unblemished it was almost featureless. And Javert, who had spent 30 years learning to read the shape of a human being through the shape of their data, felt, looking at that flawless record, the specific vertigo of a man looking at a wall that is too smooth. Real lives left marks. This one had none. It was not the record of a good man. It was the record of a man who had arrived good, fully formed at the age of 40, with nothing behind him. He could not prove anything. That was what tormented him. His faith told him the system did not lie, and the system said Madeleine was green, and so his faith and his instinct went to war inside him, and neither would surrender. He watched. He waited. He built, in the private ledger of his mind, a case with no evidence, which is the most corrosive kind of case a man can build because it feeds on itself. And then, that winter, the case broke open from the most unexpected direction, not against Madeleine, but against a stranger. In a town some distance away, a man had been arrested, a vagrant Amber caught stealing, whose facial biometrics and degraded old records flagged him, through the system's confident cross-referencing, as a long-sought fugitive. A man who, 19 plus 7 years ago, had stolen silver from an old man's house and vanished. A man named Jean Valjean. The system was certain. The biometric match sat at 96%, and the arrested vagrant, confused and half illiterate in the ways of the machine, could not account for himself, and had no clean story, and wore the amber that the system had long ago decided was the color of guilt. The trial would be brief. The system did not need much. It had a face, a flag, and a fugitive-shaped hole to fill, and it was about to fill the hole with a man who had done nothing but be poor in the wrong place at the wrong time. Javert reported this to the mayor dutifully because it was procedure, and perhaps because some part of him wanted to watch the good man's face when he heard that the ghost of an old crime had finally been caught. "The Valjean case is closed," he said. "They've apprehended him. A vagrant downstate. The match is conclusive." He watched Madeline carefully as he said it. "I only mention it, sir, because I'd flagged some irregularities in my own audit, concerns about identity fraud in the region. This closes the file. It seems I was chasing shadows." And Javert saw something cross the mayor's face that he could not name, and filed it, uneasily, alongside all the other things about this man that did not fit. What Javert did not know was the war that had just begun inside Jean Valjean. Because Valjean understood in that moment exactly what had happened. The system, in its certainty, its impartial and untiring certainty, had found a man to be him. An innocent man, some nameless amber wretch whose only crime was resembling the face on an old warrant, was about to be swallowed whole, sentenced for the theft of Myriel's silver and for every year of flight since, and the machine would call it justice, and it would be, by every metric the world trusted, correct. The case would close. The record would balance, and Madeleine, the mayor, the benefactor, the man who employed the town and had promised a dying woman to save her child, could simply say nothing. Let the machine be wrong. Let the innocent man take the amber that was truly his and go on being good, go on being Madeleine, go on keeping his promise to Cosette with clean green hands. No one would ever know. That was the horror of it. He could purchase the rest of his life and the life of Fantine's daughter at the price of one nameless stranger he would never have to meet. The system would do the killing. His hands would stay clean. He had only to be silent, and silence was the easiest thing in the world. The machine was built to reward silence. He sat alone that night with Myriel's candlesticks. He had carried them for 7 years, the only objects he owned that predated his lie, and he understood that the old man's gift had finally come due. The flag is a fact about your worst day. It is not a fact about your soul, and no machine can read the second thing, because the second thing isn't finished yet. He had spent 7 years finishing a man of whom he could almost be proud. And now the machine was offering to let that man live forever, at the cost of becoming, in the one place no machine could see, exactly the kind of soul that would let an innocent stranger burn to keep himself warm. If he stayed silent, Madeleine would survive, and Valjean, the real Valjean, the man Myriel had bought and paid for, would die in that room, quietly, with no one to witness it but the 2 candlesticks. If he spoke, he would save a stranger and destroy everything. The factory, the town's recovery, the mayoralty, and the promise to Cosette, all of it collapsing the moment the machine learned that Monsieur Madeleine's flawless green index was the largest fraud in the region's history. He was still sitting there when the sky went gray. He rose, and he dressed, and he went to the place where they were trying the man who was wearing his name, and he stood at the back of the room until the moment before the verdict, and then he walked to the front, into the range of every reader and every recording eye in the chamber, and he said the words that ended the life he had built. "You have the wrong man. I am Jean Valjean." The room's machines, so certain a moment before, fell silent, the same silence, he would think later, that had fallen over the patrol officers in Myriel's doorway, all those years ago, when a fact appeared that the system had no field to hold. And at the back of the chamber, Javert felt the wall that was too smooth finally crack, and felt, alongside a vindication so total it should have been joy, the first cold breath of a horror he did not yet understand, that the man had chosen this, that no system had caught him, that Jean Valjean had walked out of safety and into ruin for the sake of a stranger, of his own free will, and that nothing in Javert's entire faith had a way to explain why. Chapter 5: The Promise. They arrested him in the courtroom, of course. The machine, having been wrong, was now furiously eager to be right, and it processed Monsieur Madeleine into Jean Valjean with the smooth violence of a system correcting an error. His green index collapsed in real time. He watched it happen on the wall behind the magistrate, watched 7 years of a constructed life dissolve into the amber it had always been underneath, and then into something worse than amber, a color he had never seen before, the color the system reserved for those who had attacked its foundations. Index falsification, aggravated, sustained. The nameless vagrant who had worn his face was released, blinking, into a freedom he did not understand. And Valjean, who had bought that freedom with his own, was taken into custody before he had finished speaking. But there was still the promise. He had one advantage, and it was the same advantage that had let him become Madeleine in the first place. He understood the machine better than the men who trusted it. He knew where its blind spots were, the seams between one jurisdiction's records and another's, the hours when a transfer was logged but not yet verified. He had spent 19 years failing to escape from a prison, and he had learned in all that failure exactly how escapes fail. A man who has failed 4 times knows more about the wall than a man who has never touched it. He escaped during the transfer. The details do not matter: a gap in the handoff, a reader that read too slowly, a moment when the system's certainty about where he was became briefly out of date. What mattered was that he was free, Amber, hunted, and that somewhere a dying woman had already stopped waiting because Fantine did not live to see her daughter. She died in the hospital in Montreuil while the man who had promised to save her child was being processed by the machine that had killed her. He learned it the way he learned everything now, from a data trail, a status field, a life reduced to a closed record, deceased, provisional flag, resolved. The machine's way of saying that the problem she represented had solved itself. So the promise changed shape. He could not bring Cosette to her mother. He could only go and get the child himself, and make of that the only thing he had left to offer the dead, that the daughter, at least, would not be ground down the way the mother had been. He found Cosette in the town where the Thénardiers ran their arrangement, and he found her in a condition that he recognized instantly, because it was his own. She was 8 years old and she already carried a flag. Her mother's death had not resolved anything for her. The provisional mark, the mark for being born outside a registered partnership, had passed to the child like an inheritance, and the Thénardiers had used it as a leash. They fed her least and worked her most and told her, in the 1,000 small ways a system teaches a child its place, that she was less, that the number attached to her was the truth about her, that she should be grateful anyone tolerated her at all. She flinched when adults moved quickly. She had learned at 8 the half-paced step-back that the world performed around people like her, and she had learned to perform it toward herself, to shrink before she could be made to shrink. Valjean looked at her and saw the whole machine in miniature, a child being taught to carry the danger for the people who feared her, exactly as Myriel had once described it to him in a doorway. And he understood that this was what Myriel's silver had finally been spent on. Not on Madeleine, not on the factory or the town. On this, one amber man with nothing left to lose, stealing one flagged child out of the mechanism that was calmly digesting her and running. The Thénardiers did not give her up easily. Predators never surrender an asset without a price. But they were also cowards, and Valjean had learned in a courtroom that there was one thing that unsettled cruel people more than any threat: a man who did not care what happened to himself. He had already lost his name, his safety, his future. There was nothing they could take from him, and a man with nothing to lose is the one variable no system prices correctly. He took the child and he left. And then began the years that Valjean would later think of as the only ones that had ever truly belonged to him. They lived hidden, deep in the gray margins of the great city, in the districts where indexes went unread because there was no commerce worth verifying. Among the population the machine had written off entirely. He raised her under names that were not their names, teaching her, patiently, the survival grammar of an amber life, which doors to avoid, how to move below the notice of the readers, how to be no one in a world that punished anyone it could see clearly. But he taught her something else too, something Myriel had taught him. He taught her that the flag was not the soul. He would sit with her in the dark of their small hidden rooms and tell her, again and again, until she believed it the way he had finally come to believe it. The number is a fact about a day. You are the thing that isn't finished. No machine can read that part. That part is yours. She grew. That was the miracle of it, the ordinary devastating miracle. The flinching child stopped flinching. The girl who had learned to shrink learned slowly, under the shelter of one man's absolute refusal to let the world define her, to take up space. She grew into a young woman with her mother's face and none of her mother's fear, and Valjean, watching her, understood that he had done, in secret in the margins, with no name and no index and no permission from anyone, the one thing the entire system had been built to make impossible. He had let a flagged person become whole. It could not last, of course. Wholeness in a hidden life is still a hidden life, and two things were moving toward them through the years, patiently, the way the machine moved toward everything. The first was a young man named Marius, who saw Cosette in one of the rare public spaces where the margins and the world overlapped, and who fell in love with her the way the young do, completely and without checking the index. Because Marius, it happened, was one of the young people who had stopped believing in the index at all. The second was Javert. He had never stopped. In the years since the courtroom, he had risen further. His instinct about Madeleine had been vindicated so spectacularly that his career had been made by it. But the vindication had not brought him peace. It had brought him the opposite, because the case that had proven him right had also lodged in him a splinter he could not remove. The man had confessed. No system had caught Valjean in that courtroom. Valjean had caught himself, had walked out of a flawless green life to save a stranger, and had done it for a reason that Javert's entire faith could not hold. In the ledger of Javert's mind, that confession sat as an anomaly, an unexplained data point, a thing that should not exist in a universe where the number was the truth and the soul was not to be trusted. He needed to find Valjean again. He told himself it was duty, a falsification felon at large, a child illegally removed, files that had to close. But underneath the duty was something closer to terror. He needed to close the file because the open file was proof, walking around loose in the world, that his God might not be the only thing that was real. Chapter 6: The Barricade. The young people had stopped believing. It began, as these things begin, with the ones who had the least to lose and the most to notice, the near-amber generation, the children of dipped indexes, the ones who had grown up watching the machine treat their parents' worst days as permanent addresses. They gathered at first only to talk, then to organize. Then, when talk and organization were met with the machine's serene indifference, to do the one thing the system had never learned to price, to refuse it openly, in public, with their faces uncovered and their indexes on display, daring it to flag them all. Marius was among them, though he had come to it late and by way of love rather than politics. It was Cosette, and the hidden man who had raised her, who had first made real to him what the abstractions of his friends only argued. His friends were led by a young man named Enjolras, who spoke about the index the way Javert believed in it totally, with his whole soul, except that Enjolras believed the opposite thing. He believed the machine was a lie dressed as fairness. He believed that a system which treated everyone identically while starting them from unequal places had simply automated cruelty and called it neutrality. He believed, and he made others believe, that a person's worth could not be a number, and that a world which had forgotten this had to be reminded, even at the cost of blood. The confrontation, when it came in a district square, and it hardened over a long night into something like a siege. The young people barricaded into a block, having seized and shut down the network of readers that governed it, creating, for a few hours, a small impossible territory where no index could be read and no person could be flagged. A zone of the unmeasured. They knew they could not hold it. That was, in a sense, the point. They wanted the world to see, even for one night, even before it was crushed, what it looked like when human beings faced each other with no number in between. Valjean went to the barricade. He went because Cosette loved Marius and Marius was inside it, and Valjean had learned long ago that the only currency he had left to spend was himself. He went into the unmeasured zone, an amber man walking freely for the first time in his life through a space where no reader could tell anyone what he was, and he felt he was almost ashamed of it, given the danger a kind of terrible peace. This was what Muriel's house had been, a door with no reader on it. He had spent his whole life looking for the second such door, and he had finally found it, and it was going to be destroyed by morning. Inside the barricade he found something he had not expected: Javert captured. The auditor had come in disguise to gather the identities the readers could no longer capture, and the young people had caught him, and now he sat bound in a back room, waiting to learn what a mob of the unmeasured would do to the man who had spent his life measuring them. Enjolras had condemned him not from cruelty, but from the same terrible logic Javert himself lived by, the logic that says an enemy of the cause must be removed. And when they needed someone to carry out the sentence, Valjean volunteered. He took Javert into a side alley out of sight, a weapon in his hand and the auditor's whole life at his mercy. And Javert, who did not believe in evil and therefore did not believe in pleading, looked at the man he had hunted for a decade and said, flatly, the way one might state a fact into a record, "You'll do it cleanly, at least. You always were more efficient than you pretended. Go on. It closes both our files." And Valjean cut the bindings and let him go. He did it without a speech. He said only, "I'm not what your machine says I am, neither are you, go." And then, because Javert did not move, because Javert stood frozen as though the ground had tilted beneath him, "You know where I live, you know my name. When this is over, come and find me if you have to. I won't run, but not tonight. Tonight, go home." Javert went. He walked out of the barricade a free man, past the young people who did not stop him because Valjean had said it was done, and he carried out into the night a wound that no weapon had made, and that he did not know how to survive. Because the entire architecture of his life rested on a single load-bearing belief, that mercy was a weakness, a corruption, a failure of the system to do its necessary work, and the man he had spent 10 years proving was a criminal had just, for no reason, at no benefit to himself, in the middle of a war, spared his life. Not out of weakness. Valjean had held every advantage. He had spared him out of the one thing Javert's universe did not contain: a decision, freely made, to be better than the record demanded. The barricade fell before dawn the way everyone had known it would. The machine reasserted itself over the small, unmeasured zone. The readers came back online. The district was flagged, mass-processed, its brief, impossible territory folded back into the seamless world. Most of the young people did not survive the reassertion. Enjolras did not, but Marius, gravely injured, did, because Valjean carried him out. He carried him through the one part of the city no reader watched, the maintenance tunnels beneath the district, the same kind of warm, dark alcove where an amber man had slept his first night of freedom 19 years and a lifetime ago. He carried a dying young man on his back through the underworld of the machine, unseen, unmeasured, unflagged, and he brought him up on the far side into the hands of people who could save him, and he did it all without ever once being read, a ghost moving through the blind spots of a world that thought it saw everything. And when he came up out of the tunnels, filthy and half-dead himself, carrying the boy his daughter loved, there was a figure waiting at the exit. Of course there was. Javert had followed the only trail a hunter of his skill could follow, the absence of one. He had reasoned that a man who could not be read would flee through the places that could not read him, and he had positioned himself at the mouth of the dark, and now he stood between Jean Valjean and the last stretch of the promise, exactly as duty required. They looked at each other in the gray beginning of the light. Valjean, with the boy on his back, said nothing. There was nothing to say. He had told Javert the truth in the alley, and now the truth stood before its judge, amber and exhausted and entirely at the machine's mercy, having just done the most purely good thing of a life full of them, and the machine's most faithful servant had only to raise his device and speak, and the file would close, and the universe Javert believed in would be whole again. Javert raised his hand, and then he did not speak. Chapter 7: The River. Javert stood at the mouth of the tunnel with his hand raised, and his whole life waiting inside a single word he could not say. The word was simple. His device was already awake, already reading the amber ruin of the man in front of him, already forming the flag that would end the pursuit of a decade. He had only to speak the confirmation, and the machine would do everything else: dispatch, apprehension, processing, the closing of a file that had stayed open so long it had become the central fact of his existence. The system was ready. The system was always ready. It had never once in 30 years failed to do its part. The failure tonight was entirely his own, and it was the first failure of his life, and he could not understand it, and he could not overcome it, and he stood in the gray light unable to move. Because the man in front of him would not fit. That was the whole of it, reduced to its irreducible core. Jean Valjean would not fit inside the record. The record said, felon, falsifier, fugitive, a danger to be removed. And every one of those things was true. Javert had built his career on their truth, had been vindicated by their truth, had never once been wrong about the facts. But the facts, standing before him with a dying boy on its back, having spared his life in an alley for no gain, having carried an enemy's future through the blind dark of the world at the cost of its own escape. The facts had done something the record had no field to hold. And Javert understood, with the slow horror of a man watching his own foundation crack, that he had spent his life believing the record was the truth, when the record was only ever a measurement of the truth. And there were truths, apparently, that could not be measured, and one of them was standing in front of him, amber and exhausted and better than any green man Javert had ever audited. He lowered his hand. "Go," he said. His voice did not sound like his own. "Take the boy, go." Valjean did not thank him. He understood, perhaps better than Javert did, what it had cost. He simply looked at the auditor for a long moment, the way Myriel had once looked at a thief in a doorway, the arithmetic of a kind the machine had no word for, and then he turned and carried Marius up into the waking city, into the last stretch of the promise, and was gone. And Javert was left alone with the wreckage of his God. He did not go home. He walked. He walked through the city he had spent his life keeping ordered, past the readers at every door doing their patient work, past the seamless world of green indexes and clean transactions, and everywhere he looked he saw now the thing he had never let himself see, that the machine he had loved was not justice. It was only consistency. It applied its rules without malice and without exception, exactly as he had always admired, and it had killed Fantine with that consistency, and leashed a child with it, and burned a district of the young with it, and would have, tonight, closed the file on the single most genuinely good human being Javert had ever encountered, and it would have called every one of those things fairness, and it would have been by its own logic correct. The machine did not lie. That was what he had always loved about it. And now he saw that a thing could be perfectly, tirelessly honest, and still be a mechanism for grinding souls into numbers, and that he had given his entire life to it, and that he could not give it back. He came, near dawn, to a bridge over the black river that ran through the heart of the city. There was a way out for him. This was the part that undid him completely. His own device, his own authority, his own perfect knowledge of the system seems. He could have flagged Valjean and been vindicated, or unflagged himself from the whole intolerable question, and gone on serving, letting the man go and telling no one, filing the anomaly away unexamined the way lesser men filed away everything they could not face. Either path let him keep living. But Javert could not take either, and the reason he could not was the reason he had loved the machine in the first place. He was, at his root, a man who could not tolerate a contradiction. He had built his life on the belief that the record was the soul. He had discovered that it was not. And a man cannot serve a God he has stopped believing in, nor can he unlearn once he has seen it, the thing he has seen. If Valjean was good, then the system was capable of grinding down the good, and Javert had spent his life turning its wheels. If the system was just, then a good man had to be destroyed to prove it, and Javert could not do that either, not anymore, because he had held the weapon in the alley and he had lowered it and he could not lift it again. Both of his gods had failed at once. There was no record with a field for what he had become. He had spent his whole life refusing to trust the human soul with its own judgment. And now his soul had made a judgment, had made it in an alley, had made it at a tunnel mouth, and it had judged against everything he was, and he did not know how to be a man on the far side of that. He stood on the bridge for a long time in the gray light. Then he did the last thing. The system logged it, of course, the way it logged everything. A device going still, a status field resolving. The machine had no way to record what a bridge and a black river had meant to the man who stopped on it. It recorded only the outcome, the closed file, the anomaly at last removed. Deceased. The same two words it had used for Fantine. The machine's way of saying that a problem had solved itself. It did not know that the problem it had solved was the last honest believer it would ever have. Jean Valjean kept the promise. Marius lived. He and Cosette married, in one of the quiet, unregistered ways the margins had invented for people the machine would not bless, and Valjean gave them what he had, which was, in the end, the same thing Marius had once given him. He gave them the belief that they were not their numbers. He gave Cosette a way into a life, and he stepped back from it, because he understood something Marius had also understood, that the amber does not soften with love, it only hides. And a man who loved the child he had raised would not chain his stain to her future. So he withdrew, quietly, into the margins where he had always belonged, and let them believe he was resting. He did not tell them for a long time who he was. When at last he did, when the years had thinned him and he knew the withdrawal was becoming the final one, he told Cosette the whole of it. The bread, the 19 years, the silver, the name that was not his name, the courtroom, the tunnels. He told her the way Marius had told him the truth in a doorway, without weight, as the most ordinary thing in the world. And Cosette, who had learned at 8 to flinch, and had unlearned it in the shelter of this man's refusal to let the world define her, did the thing the whole machine had been built to make impossible. She did not step back the half pace. She took his hand. "You raised me to know that the number is a fact about a day," she said. "Did you think I wouldn't apply it to you?" He died in the margins, unread, unflagged, with the 2 candlesticks beside the bed, the only objects he had carried through every life, from the doorway to the factory to the tunnels to the end. He died amber. The system never softened it. The flag was intact in his record at the moment it closed: violent felony, index falsification, aggravated. The machine's confident and permanent verdict on the worst days of a life it had never once managed to read. By every metric the world trusted, Jean Valjean died a criminal, and the machine was, as always, correct. And it did not matter at all, because there was someone in the room who held his hand and knew the second thing, the thing that isn't finished, the thing no reader had ever been built to see, and in the only ledger that had ever counted the truth, the ledger kept in the memory of the people we have refused to let the world reduce. Jean Valjean died exactly what Marius had bought and paid for on a gray morning long ago. Not the flag. A man. The end.